Hello, everybody. We're going to continue building our knowledge about the British colonial regions by analyzing the Southern Colonies. And so just like our lessons in the New England colonies and the Middle colonies, we're going to focus in three different areas. We're going to look at society and day-to-day life within the Southern colonies. We're going to look at the economic systems and the ways of making and spending money in the Southern colonies. And finally, we will look at the political and governmental practices and systems that are found in this area. So because we have taken time within those other regions talking about these three areas, let's go ahead and get started by looking at what colonies were in the Southern Colonies region. Well, if you start at that top flat border with Pennsylvania and Maryland, Virginia, North Carolina, South Carolina, and Georgia, we have the Southern Colonial region. We have a diverse amount of crops that are going to be grown within this region as well, where we will see rice and indigo be found in the Carolinas and into Georgia, and we will see tobacco be grown in great amounts in Virginia and in parts of Maryland. So society within the Southern Colonies is very important to analyze because, first, there was no predominant religion. Basically, there was no one major religion within the Southern Colonies. So generally speaking, there was more acceptance and tolerance about religion in this area. Now, we see this similar fact within the Middle Colonies, but very much different than within the New England region, where there was a heavy Puritan influence within that area. So we even see within the Maryland colony, specifically within Baltimore as well, that it was initially, or at first, very welcoming of Catholics and people of the Catholic faith. But this would actually have some conflict that would occur later in the growth of the colony. So we see here a diversity of religions being practiced. We also see an increased amount of tolerance about religion found within this region. Also, within this area, we see very rural society. Rural means that there's a lot of farms and agriculture land, a lot of open space. And because of these large farms, also known as plantations, people did not live very close to each other. So when we think today about how close we are to our neighbors, maybe in some places, maybe 50 feet, maybe in others a couple hundred feet, some even closer than that. In these rural societies, they were incredibly far apart because of the large amounts of land that were used in farming. So there was this focus on farming within this colonial region. And because of the farming and the goods that would be produced in this region, primarily the tobacco, the rice, and the indigo, there were strong ties with the British. And this was really due or because of the British were purchasing or buying the goods and materials from the South. Basically, the Southern Colonies really liked Great Britain because Great Britain was buying the stuff that they were growing. And so they were benefiting from that trade from Great Britain. But it's also important to mention here that this is also where we see a dependence on the different British colonial regions on each other. Because trading was not a large focus within the Southern Colonies. And so the Southern Colonies would sell their goods or their crops to the Middle or New England colonies that would then ship those goods or crops to Europe or other parts of the world. So we see how, even though that there are very large differences within the societies of New England, the Middle Colonies, and the Southern Colonies, they very much depended upon each other, especially for wealth and within their trade. Now, society within the Southern Colonies had the highest concentration of slaves and the highest concentration of the system of slavery in the original 13 colonies. There were an incredibly large amount of Africans that were kidnapped and forced into slavery found within the Southern Colonies. Now, there were also slaves found within the Middle and New England colonies, but if you remember from an earlier data table that we looked at, there were an incredible amount of slaves found within the Southern Colonies. We will also be examining more about slavery and its impact upon slaves themselves in a further module when we examine the impacted groups because of colonization. There was a wide distribution of wealth in the Southern Colonies. There were the plantation farmers. These were the plantation, or these gigantic farm owners that were incredibly wealthy. These plantations almost always, and unfortunately, had slaves. So the plantation farmers' wealth came through the forced slave labor of African slaves. We also find within the Southern Colonies yeoman farmers. Yeoman farmers were farmers that had a moderate-sized piece of land that they could farm on, that they then could grow and harvest the crops on with just their family. So it wasn't so large as the plantation farmers, but the yeoman farmers would have moderate to large size farms that they could do with just their family members and without the system of slavery being practiced on that farm. We also have many poor farmers in the Southern Colonies that are attempting to increase their wealth from moving from Europe to the Southern Colonies and having small farms that they themselves are growing crops to help provide just for them and just for their day-to-day living. The wealth in this region would influence the politics and societies within the Southern Colonies. There was an incredible amount of wealth within the Southern Colonies, but it is very important to remember that that wealth was because of the forced and unfair system and practice of slavery. So the economics within the Southern Colonies were based primarily around agriculture. Agriculture is another word for farming. So there were extremely large farms that were called plantations, as we discussed, that were found throughout the Southern Colonies. And the workforce within these plantations was the forced and unfair slave labor system found throughout the Southern Colonies. And we talked about crops and the three cash crops. The three things that the Southern Colonies grew that would make them the most money were nicknamed cash crops, were tobacco, rice, and indigo. Now, I know you might be thinking that you have previously heard about cotton plantations, but cotton plantations will develop after the plantations of tobacco, rice, and indigo are first established. And you will learn about those in a later module later on in this course. The government and politics in the Southern Colonies was mixed. And we see that because there were two types of colonies within this region. So some of the colonies were known as royal colonies. And this is where the British king would appoint or choose the leadership of that colony. This is where the king had heavy influence into the laws, the rights, and the practices that existed within those colonies. But we also find within the Southern Colonies what are known as proprietary colonies, and those colonies is where the leadership was chosen by the community through that democratic process and practice of voting. So we will see common assemblies. But it's important to realize that it's mixed within the Southern Colonies because most of the colonies within the Southern Colonies were royal colonies. And so we again see a heavy British influence within the Southern colonial region, first because the British were buying a lot of those cash crops. buying and purchasing a lot of tobacco, rice, and indigo. Secondly, we see an increased amount of British influence in the southern colonies because most of the colonies were royal colonies. These are the colonies where the British king had a heavy amount of control over who was leading those colonies and what rights and freedoms those within the southern colonies practiced. And so we see this very mixed society within southern colonies where we see an incredible amount of wealth, but that wealth is gained through the horrible practice of slavery. We see a heavy influence of the British in the southern colonies because of the British purchasing of those cash crops. But we also see a diverse amount of religions within the area. So this really gives us a better understanding of the diversity between the three British colonial regions after we have now learned about the southern colonies. I hope that this helps you answer all of those questions that are on your student handout sheet, and I hope that each of you have a wonderful day.